Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode. In just over a month, I can finally say that we are launching my brand new membership, the Fix Your Period Collective, a first of its kind membership platform that will give you personalized information about your menstrual cycle displayed in a dashboard format once you take our detailed period quiz. Inside the membership, you're going to find the Period Pillars, which is my step-by-step signature program, dozens of condition-specific period protocols, everything from heavy periods to painful periods to everything in between, a recipe room, community, supplement shop, all of my blog posts and podcasts organized by category, and a product shop with pretty much every period product imaginable. This membership has been nearly 2 years in the making and has been a true labor of love. And I absolutely cannot wait for you to take the period quiz and experience it. And of course, take advantage of everything this platform has to offer. So stay tuned for more in the coming weeks, and I will definitely let you know when it's all available. All right, today's episode. I am talking to Dr. Jolene Brighten. She's a hormone expert and thought leader in women's medicine and the author of Is This Normal? A comprehensive guide to creating hormone balance and reclaiming your sexual desire. Throughout our conversation, we explore some of the fundamental questions about female anatomy and libido that often go unanswered. From understanding the difference between the vagina and the vulva to debunking common myths about masturbation and orgasms, Dr. Brighten sheds light on topics that are crucial for every woman's health and well-being. We dig deep into sex drive, what's normal and what's not, why some women have higher sex drives than others, whether women just generally have a lower sex drive than men, how our cycles affect our sex drive, and the ways in which we can improve a low libido. So if you love this episode, please don't forget to share it with someone in your life. And of course, talk about it on Instagram. I'm at Nicole M. Jardim, and Jolene is Dr. Jolene Brighten. So please make sure to tag us if you share the episode. Enjoy, and I will talk to you soon. Hi, Jolene. Welcome to the show.
Hey there. It's kind of funny, right? We just talked for like an hour and now we're like, oh, we're going to hit the record button. Oh, if people could have been a fly on the wall.
If only you all could have heard what we just talked about. Anyways, this will all be very juicy too. I have no doubt. I mean, we're talking about libido. Who doesn't want to talk about that? I feel like it's a hot topic. Anyways, I'm so happy you're here, and I am excited to talk about so many of the topics that are in your book, Is This Normal? And one of the first things that I really wanted to talk about was the difference between the vagina and the vulva. I'm going right in because I was thinking about the Gillian Anderson dress, the Golden Globes dress that she wore, and
Oh, yeah.
right, it had embroidered vulvas all over it.
Yeah.
But of course, 99% of the news outlets and the memes and everything referred to them as vaginas. Can we just put this one to rest already? Like we
Totally.
gotta talk this one through.
I mean, that's part of why she did it, right? I mean, a canal would be kind of boring to show the vagina, but I mean, that's also part of why she did it. That was her character. That is what she spent time explaining in multiple episodes of Sex Education. If you guys haven't seen it, see it. It's so good. I love it. So vulva, that's the outside. That is the labia majora, the labia minora, what people call the lips, right? Outer, inner lips. That is where the outer portion of the clitoris lives. That is where you're going to see from belly button to anus, so top to bottom. That's where you're going to see urethra, vagina, and anus. Like you're going to see all of that anatomy on the outside. It just like the anus is on the outside, that there's a tube on the inside. I think everybody can understand this, men and women. Is that, there's a tube that extends inside. When you look at the vulva, there's the introitus, there's the opening, and then there is the vagina, and that is 100% internal structure. Even though I think it was Vagisil that had their social media campaign, and they're like, clean your outer vagina. And I'm like, what's an outer vagina? Person behind social media. What is that exactly? That's not a thing. So the vulva is the outside, the vagina is the inside, and why that is so important is you should always know your anatomy, know how to communicate it. Like I say, and Is This Normal? I don't care what you call it. Like whatever you want to call it at home is what you call it at home, but it's important when you're communicating with your doctor, like what's going on. But in addition, when we talk about things like cleaning the vagina. We never want to do that. Often when I say that on social media, I remember I put out this TikTok, man, it blew up and people just were like so crazy where I was like, you don't need to clean your vagina. They're like, you're disgusting. I can tell you smell like fish through here, like saying all of these horrible things to me. And I always laugh because, especially when it's like awful men doing that in the comments, because I'm like, oh, you sound so dumb right now. Like, because you don't understand what you're talking about, but you're perpetuating these myths. So the vulva, it only requires warm water and friction. Washcloths are your friend. If you want to use some soap, keep it mild. There's no reason to go scrubbing, especially around the urethra. That can get uncomfortable, especially if you've had multiple vaginal deliveries, so multiple children via vaginal delivery. But the vagina inside, self-cleaning, very delicate balance of estrogen helping the cells produce glycogen, helping feed the lactobacilli. The lactobacilli then produce acid that keeps the pH tightly regulated. And if you want to find yourself with a yeast infection or bacterial vaginosis, then go ahead and douche and go inside and try to scrub with soap. But that's not necessary. So those are the differences. You will find vulva diagrams in my book. You'll find lots of diagrams in my book, but it's really important to understand this so that you know your own body, your own anatomy, you know what's going on, and you know how to care for yourself.
Amen. Thank you so much. That was such a great explanation. I feel like when you were talking about scrubbing inside, I was like, ouch. But I know that we don't even get this information and we don't have any idea.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you for that. And this builds on a little bit of what you were just talking about. I know you mentioned in your book there were multiple studies and polls about, how little we know collectively about our lady parts and how they work. And I think there was in one study you talked about 45% of women and 60% of men couldn't identify the vagina, and in one poll, and then there was like 50% of women couldn't identify the cervix in a chart of the reproductive system. And I feel like there's such a huge knowledge gap when it comes to female anatomy, and it's been harming us for so long. Can you talk about that? Why women don't know the basics of their own anatomy, like the difference, as you said, between the vagina and the vulva, that we have 3 holes, we can't identify a cervix. It's crazy.
We've got a lot of issues in our society. One being that we don't mandate medically accurate sex education in schools. And whenever I say that, people are like, well, children shouldn't learn about sex. And I'm like, okay, so like sex education is a big umbrella. It's not just intercourse, although that's usually the only thing that like really gets taught is like women, penises go in your vagina, babies come out of them, and you get a period. And nobody goes in depth of like explaining anatomy, talking about the different components. Most of the time, the instructors don't understand. So the surveys and it's like still like it like takes my breath away. The surveys show us that most of the people providing this health education, this sex education in schools, they don't want to say the word vagina. They won't say it. They won't say it. Grey's Anatomy won't say it. Like the TV show won't say it. They'll talk about a penis all day, every day, because that's been normalized. So there's a lot of stigma around female anatomy. There's a lack of information and medically accurate information. As I say in the book, if it's not medically accurate, it's not accurate. It's just not. It's not based on science. It's based on beliefs and propaganda, and that serves absolutely no one. And it becomes very problematic because there's the point of us not knowing our body, but now we've gone all these politicians legislating on our body, but they couldn't tell you that we have 2 ovaries or where those are located, or how that, when I explain to people that fertilization happens in the fallopian tubes, they're like, wait, what? Yes, egg and sperm meet in the fallopian tubes. It's got to cruise down. It's got like a 5-day journey. And then if it gets to the endometrial lining and things are good, then it actually implants. And they're like, hold up. Like, I didn't understand all of that. Yeah, neither do these politicians who are actually legislating on your body. They don't even understand how periods work. Shit, even NASA didn't even understand that like a woman doesn't need like, an entire spaceship of tampons to travel with her when she gets her period. Like it's so astounding. And when you think about it that way, it's affecting us on so many levels. There's the individual level, there's society, there's political legislation, there's NASA. Like there's women going into space that are running into these issues. But it also translates in a lot of other ways. I had a patient recently that I met with, and we were talking about how she's been trying to conceive. and her luteal phase is 6 days. She's like, I get my period 6 days after I ovulate. And I'm like, okay, how many doctors have you seen? Five doctors. Five doctors, and not one of them told you that your luteal phase has got to be at least 10 days, if not longer. Because again, egg and sperm meet, fertilization happens, blastocyst starts rapidly dividing and making its way down. And it isn't until 5 days ish later that implantation occurs. So if you're bleeding right away at like 6 days, the endometrium is not stable enough. Things have not been built up. And immediately she's like, well, this is my fault because I should have understood this. And I'm like, this is what women constantly do, is they are not given the information. Like who's going to teach you? If your mom didn't teach you and no one taught her, like who's going to teach you? But you take it upon yourself to be like, well, this is my fault for not understanding that. How would you even begin to know that that's the Google search that you need to be doing? Yes, we have tons of information out there, but at what point does the average individual stop and be like, oh, could there be a problem at this point? Like, I feel like too often women internalize these issues that doctors, medicine, sex education, society as a whole, these lack of educational pieces that should have been given to them, they feel like it's their fault. And they take it on as their fault for not knowing this information. I just think, what a burden on an individual when we could have just taught them this information to begin with.
Totally. I know. When you were saying about women apologizing for not knowing, I feel like that is just what happens to women in medicine. I was just reading about this book that this woman I think it was a New York Times article about this author, Dr. Elizabeth Coleman, I think her name is. She's a breast cancer specialist. And she's talking all about like, it's not all in your head, sexism in medicine, all this stuff. And she was saying that one of her patients was dying and she was saying her final goodbye to her. And she was like all clammy, the patient was. And this woman says to her, I'm so sorry for sweating on you. And she's literally on her deathbed. And I just was just like, oh my gosh, this is so powerful because this is exactly what you speak of. And it just is rampant throughout from the time we start to the very end. We're apologizing for ourselves and especially for not knowing what we should, what there's no way to know about this stuff. It's like you said too, about how do you know what to even search for? Yes, there's tons of information out there, but if you don't even have the basic knowledge, it's very difficult to find what it is that we're all putting out into the world because you don't even know the context. It's crazy.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's, I think, important for people to understand, is that this is why healthcare practitioners exist, is so that you can focus on what your expertise and your specialty is in life. And we should be the ones helping you understand your body, educating you about it, and helping bridge that gap of knowledge. Unfortunately, so often, and there's a chapter in my book, is this normal, in that book in particular, it's called Sex of All Kinds. And I can't even tell you how many people have just on the internet proclaimed to me how they skipped that chapter because, like, why are you talking all about sex? That chapter is about pain with sex. That chapter is about endometriosis, adenomyosis, fibroids, cysts. It's about all of the pain conditions that get overlooked and dismissed, and how often women feel incomplete and as if they can't have a complete sex life because they've been told that sex is penetration and nothing else. And it was a way to, one, help them understand their condition, help them get a diagnosis that they need, and also understand that there's a lot of other ways to get pleasure other than just having penetration. A woman with vaginismus often feels like, oh, I'm incomplete, like I can't have sex, like I am broken. This is not true. Like maybe it looks different for you than like what you see in the media all the time. But I open up that chapter talking about how pervasive it is that women's pain is dismissed. And I'm not talking about pain with sex. I'm talking about heart attacks. I'm talking about severe abdominal pain. I'm talking about strokes. I'm talking about you go to the ER and they're like, Do you got ovaries? Were you born with a vulva? You're fine. It's in your head, you little drama queen. Go home. And women go home to die. So then when we talk about reproductive pain, that's even more minimized. If someone won't take your heart attack seriously and they think that you're making it up and that you're just hysterical, like, do not even for a minute think that your gynecological conditions aren't also ending up at the bottom of the list in terms of priority in some of these providers' minds.
Yes, exactly. Oh, so much to unpack. And, it kind of leads me into what we're going to talk about, really, which is the whole libido conversation. But there was something you also spoke about in the book. It was about the fact that the clit has been omitted from medical textbooks. And there's a woman, Jessica Pinn, who talks a lot about this in her work around, what is it? Like, vaginoplasties and how
Yeah.
they go wrong all the time, and that's been her her mission in life to speak out about that, but that's something that I didn't really know about, obviously, because I didn't go to med school, but I really only learned about it from her, the fact that there isn't correct anatomy in medical textbooks.
No, there's not. And so she's actually been involved in research. I have one of her studies cited in Is This Normal? She actually sent me the research study. I think she's doing phenomenal work.
Yeah.
And, in terms, so she's bringing awareness to the fact that, and I talk about all of this in the book as well, the rise of labiaplasty. And a lot of this is coming, we're going to get hate for this. It's inevitable, but a lot of cosmetic surgeons, not plastic surgeons, but cosmetic surgeons who are marketing on social media. And listen, if you're a cosmetic surgeon and you're not doing this, then you can just keep on keeping on. You don't have to comment. And if you are a cosmetic surgeon and you are doing this and you feel the need to comment, sure, let us know who you are, please, by all means. Because marketing to teenage girls and being a predator in telling them that their labia minora should be tucked up inside, because what's the most popular surgery? The Barbie. Like, Barbie doesn't even have genitals. And that's what we're telling teenage girls that they should look like. That's what we're telling women they should look like. Now, there are rare instances where the labia minora has hypertrophy, and it does extend beyond the labia majora. So the inner lips are poking out. You've got an outie, is what people will call it. They call it an outie vagina, as we established. It's not a vagina, but that's still what people call it. With that, it can become uncomfortable. It can be problematic for some people. And in those instances, they should have an individualized conversation with their provider and get an informed consent. But they should also understand that if their doctor wasn't taught about clitoral anatomy, I mean, it was just a couple of years ago. So for a very long time, and people can raise their hand if they've heard that the clitoris has 8,000 nerve endings, that research was based on a cow. And we just had the first human study 2 years ago. And that showed that it's 10,000 plus, and it needs to be replicated. We have to replicate that study to really understand how true is that. That's a little understanding that a provider has on the clitoris. And why do I say a provider? Because if the information doesn't exist, if the research hasn't been done, the clinician cannot be trained in it. I think people really need to understand that how we practice medicine is guided by the researchers and the information that they make available, and our patient experience and what our patients tell us and listening to them. So I bring this up because at one point, teenage girls were the highest recipients of labiaplasty, getting these surgeries. And Jessica Pinn shares her story. She was one of them, and it resulted in clitoral damage to her clitoris, taking away her ability to experience pleasure, which even the World Health Organization says is an absolute pillar of health. It is necessary to have that. I think it's incredibly problematic that a provider would take to TikTok to market to a teenage girl to tell her that her body has something wrong with it, when 50% of women have that outie. It's roughly 50%, but you don't even see that in medical textbooks. And I bring that up because I've seen too many providers say porn is the entire reason. Porn is the problem. And this is very like on brand for doctors to always blame anyone else but their own colleagues for what's really happening. I was very curious in this. I actually have shared before, I had to set up my office in a completely different way because in researching for this book, sometimes websites would pop up because I'm like trying to like look up information on the clitoris, and then up pops a website I never consented to. And I'm like, oh my God, I don't want a child or anyone walking in and ever seeing this. And that I'm actually like really grateful for that experience because it made me realize like what patients are going through. I never like, because I'm like, where are these myths coming from? I'd never gone to the internet to look for these things. And then I realized like, wow, there's a lot of untrustworthy places that come up. But when you look at, so I found what was really interesting is that Pornhub, which is a huge, well, I think a lot of people know what it is. It's just a huge pornographic website. And they had like this survey of like voting for like, you know, the best vulva. And what came out of that, and if people like, if right now you're having a visceral reaction to porn, please just stay with me because this information is interesting, is that men who are predominantly viewing this did not have a preference for an innie. They actually, what we found is that variety is what exists in porn, and variety is what people are after. And so when I looked at, well, where is the place where we only get one type of body? It's medical textbooks, it's medical anatomy. It is always an innie, okay? It's always the inner labia is tucked up inside. It's always uniform in color. These are like, let me just tell everybody, vulvas are not uniform in color. It's always symmetrical. This is also doesn't track with reality, and it's always a white body. It's pink. Okay. That if you go and you actually look at like Netter's Anatomy and different medical anatomy books that we use in training, it's showing doctors there's only one type. And if that's where you go as a patient, it's showing patients there's only one type. And then to add to that, we know that the clitoris, so I have several diagrams of the clitoris in Is This Normal? Because I'm like, go Jessica, but I'm not going to sit around and wait for medicine to change before I educate the individual on what their clitoris looks like. So I just put it in the book, and I even overlaid a vulva on it so that people could really understand their own anatomy. Now, what's funny about the clitoris is that a lot of people are like, oh, the clitoris was discovered in the late 90s. You know, the internet was invented in like 1985, I think it was. So like the internet's invented and then the clitoris is not discovered until the late 90s. And that's something that like you'll hear people talk about. It's a funny fact, but the reality is that's not true. It was acknowledged in the late 90s. But we know that as far back as it was the 1800s, so the mid 1800s, that was the first autopsy where the clitoris was well documented. They knew in the 1800s it was this giant structure, not just little tiny nub that you see on the outside of medical anatomy books. It wasn't until 1981 that it was in Gray's Anatomy, but it actually got removed from the literature. So they knowingly removed the clitoris from the medical literature. It was a conscious decision. Sorry, you just lost me. It was a conscious decision to take that out. Male anatomy has always been fully represented in all of its glory, taking up like 15 pages of anatomy book. And then you've got female anatomy, and it's just like, here's a vulva on one page, and we'll just like show this tiny little clitoris. And then like, here's a baby in the body. Like there's not a lot of real estate to female anatomy, which is arguably so much more complex than male anatomy. And with that, I think it's so important for everyone to understand. It comes back to what we talked about in the beginning. If you don't understand all of this about your body, understand your doctor doesn't even understand all of this about your body, because medicine, which was predominantly, it was all men back then, made the conscious decision that because the clitoris existed solely for pleasure, that it wasn't important to learn about. And that is why now, fast forward today, there's all these women telling their stories about having injuries to their clitoris when their doctor has operated for various different situations.
Yeah, the gaslighting around that really is quite shocking to me. I guess it is and it isn't shocking, but I can't get over what Jessica's been through in her journey, and then also what I see with, you know, the stories that she shares online, and then these women going to their doctors and then totally being gaslit about the damage that was done. I think that exists in every aspect of women's health and women's medicine, but it is so frustrating to see that, because like that's, to me, feels like the ultimate damage, because there's no fixing that.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
what's interesting is that I do talk in the book about spinal injuries, people who have spinal injuries, and how the same nerve tracts that are for pleasure in the pelvis, people can start having orgasms, like if they're tickled on their belly. Like, so what does that tell us? Pleasure is very, very important as a human experience. So, because look, if it wasn't, the body wouldn't put the effort in developing new neuronal pathways to help you experience pleasure. It is important. And so while there is this clitoral damage, I think what we need now is we need research to help us in that kind of rehabilitation of like what can be done to help that individual. We know the outer clitoris, the outer portion, that's very, very sensitive. That is the primary way the majority of women reach orgasm, but there's this vast internal structure and there's all of these other nerves. But what I'll also say, anyone who's ever had nerve damage knows this, nervous system tissue is one of the slowest to heal. And so we're talking like 6 years in some instances, 10 years in some instances, depending on the extent of nerve damage. And this is where there's just a huge question mark in medicine. I think, there, like you throw out a topic of women's medicine, and I will just tell you there's a huge question mark because there's so many gaps in our knowledge in so many ways. And this is where providers need to first do no harm, and second, be humble and recognize that we're operating off the best information we have, but this may not be the best information that we'll ever have. God, I hope not.
Oh, me too. Girl, me too. So that brings me to libido, since we're talking about all this stuff. And, I was thinking about this as I was preparing for this call or this interview, and I was thinking about low libido and how it feels to me like a bit of an epidemic among women these days. Well, at least among the ones that I know of who are in their late 30s and 40s,
Yeah.
and the people in my community as well. I ask these questions, and I think that it would be good to know what the definition of a low libido is, obviously, because what's normal for one person isn't necessarily normal for another. So I would love for you to talk about that.
Libido is one of those ones that we definitely compare ourselves to like everybody, and they're
Yeah.
like, oh, something's wrong with me, right? I, will ask patients sometimes, like, are you comparing bowel movements with your patient or with your neighbors? Like, are you comparing your period with your neighbors and being like, oh God, like you have a 3-day period and I have a 4-day period, so something must be wrong. Like this, you're not talking about sleep, you're not talking about anything, but libido, yes. And so when it comes to libido, your normal is all that we care about. What is your baseline? And if a patient comes to me and they say, oh, I have a low libido, I ask, compared to what? If it's not compared to how I've always been, what I've always experienced, it's not usually a problem. Because, if you are saying I have a low libido compared to my partner, okay, and you probably have a different REM cycle compared to your partner. You probably have a different, chronotype. So sleep, like something like that. You're going to have these differences. And so what matters most is where it has been your normal and has there been a change? If there has been a change, there is some problem going on. The problem might be related to relationship, to body image issues, to chronic illness, to inflammation, to hormonal issues. Like that's what a provider's job is let's figure out what's happening here. But if you're somebody who's like, so here's a common scenario. Someone says, oh, I have a low libido. I say, okay, tell me more about that. What does that mean to you when you say that? Oh, well, I find that, sometimes in the month I'm really in the mood, and then there's like 2 weeks out of the month that like I just don't even care. I don't care about sex at all, and it's like so much effort to get things going. Congratulations, you're probably ovulating. So what we're seeing is you were in the sexual phase of your cycle when hormones were up, estrogen's up, testosterone's up. It's stimulating you to think about sex. It's like getting the brain going and the genitals will respond. And then once you ovulate, it's very, very normal to go into that phase where you would rather get into sweatpants than get into their pants because progesterone's like, look, You done had the opportunity to capture some sperm and get knocked up. You either did it or you didn't, but I don't care because like we're going progesterone now. And estrogen's just there being like, yeah, but like think about sex. It's so fun. So that's normal. Another
Jolene, you're
thing that
killing me. I'm sorry. I'm just laughing. Like you'd rather get into to sweatpants than their pants. How do you come up with this stuff?
everybody knows, come on, I live it. I live
Yeah,
it. We've all
it's
lived
true.
it. You know, when you're
We
like,
all know.
man, like
Yeah.
you're like, you know, there's like a snuggie. You're like the snuggie. I don't know. It's like I could take off my pants or I could be in a snuggie. Like
Very true.
so
It's so true. It's very much a lived experience. It's so
yeah,
true.
so those cyclical changes, those are normal. The other
Yeah.
thing people will say to me is that, like, I don't think about sex. Like, I don't think about sex. I don't initiate sex. And then I ask, okay, but once things get going, how do you feel about it? Oh, well, once things get going, then yeah, I'm all about it. Great, you have responsive desire. That's normal. So there's responsive and spontaneous desire, and all you see in the media is spontaneous desire, like, oh, like, you know, a rap video is like, I remember this as a kid. The rap video was like this woman. This is so, I'm like, this is when MTV had music videos. She's like watching this rapper on TV or something. I sound so old saying it like that. And then she's like, oh, like, I didn't understand it. It took like a few at watching it to understand that, like, she started self lubricating at such a high rate. She had to take off her underwear and wash them and all this stuff. And like, and as a kid, like I bring this up because that's what was, oh, that's what it's like. If you're aroused, that's what it's like. Okay. So here I am as a teenager being like, something's wrong with me. But then we see other things that, like, oh wow, they just look at each other and, like, you know, there's no time for a condom or anything because within 3 minutes she's orgasming. Like, oh, it's like, and there are people that exists and that's true for them. That's all we see as the normal. So we think like, I have to be that way. That's what's normal. That's spontaneous desire. That is, sex is on your brain. You probably experienced this at some point around ovulation where you're like scrolling social media or you're at the grocery or there's just some kind of sexual input that comes in, whether it's imagery or something else. And then your brain's like, oh, sex. And your genitals are like, oh, hi. And you're like, wait a minute. Like sometimes you're like, I'm not even into this. Like that. And that's just because your body is surveying, just like you survey for stress and nutrients in the environment. You also survey for sex. And this is all running in the programming, basically in the back of your mind. So there is the what's happening to you cyclically with your hormones, and then there's also the, is it spontaneous and like the media, maybe not. It might be responsive, and that is that things have to get going and you have to have enough stimuli for you to start craving and thinking about and desiring sex, and that is also normal as well.
Yeah. Okay. So you said something that made me think of the Barbie vulva because it's what we're seeing, right? On TV or, in porn or whatever in the media. And it's that sex just happens and it's perfectly spontaneous and the woman's having an orgasm in like 2 minutes flat type of thing. And it's just so, I just think that that gets into women's heads and
Yeah.
they automatically think there's something wrong. And like you said, the first question you're asking is, well, what are you comparing this low libido of yours to exactly? Like whose low libido or whose libido are you talking about? And that's a really
Yeah.
great point. Yeah. So, what about the hormones involved when we're talking about someone's sex drive? Because I think that that's, as you said, right, there's a whole cyclical component to it. But is there anything more that you want to share about what hormones are playing a role in our sex drive and what we should be looking out for?
Everybody is always surprised. So I will ask this at conferences when I'm lecturing. Like, if I had to ask you, what hormone do you think is influencing women's sexual desire? What are they going to say? Testosterone. Immediately. Why? Because medicine has always held men as the standard. They look at men, they say this is the way it is, and then here's the inferior model with baby making accessories. And if it is, not interested in sex, well, maybe that's its normal. Maybe it doesn't have enough testosterone over there. And true, testosterone is very important in sexual desire. It's also like, I want people to understand that if you have low libido, I've never seen somebody in my clinical practice in running labs, I've never seen somebody who only complains of low libido and they have no other symptoms and they have low testosterone. If you have low testosterone, you also have low muscle mass. It's hard to put on muscle. You're losing muscle. You're maybe feeling more inflamed, but you also usually less motivated. You wake up with less energy and you cry a lot easier. It's important to understand that because often women will be like, I have low libido. I need testosterone. Maybe. If you are perimenopause, postmenopausal, maybe. Understand that the ovaries do make testosterone, but once you cross the threshold into menopause, you still have roughly 50% of testosterone coming from your adrenal glands. So not everybody automatically needs testosterone. I feel like it's more common in this day and age to see that like everybody, like literally everybody is needing more testosterone. And I hypothesize and based off of some of the research that's been coming out about endocrine disruptors, that because we have so much xenoestrogens in our environment, that may be playing a role. So I do want to just acknowledge that to everybody, that if you're like, but I do need it, it may be. Like, we're certainly seeing, I mean, it used to be that like men were getting testosterone in their like 50s and 60s, and now 30s and 40s, we're seeing younger and younger men needing it. But men aside, let's go back to women. So ovaries. Okay. The other thing that I want people to understand is estrogen is so, so important in sexual desire and sexual function. It's why your tissues get engorged. It's why you're able to self-lubricate. It's how your vagina is able to throw down and safeguard against anything that might go inside, because it's keeping that pH. Estrogen is such a key component in that. And it's also what's stimulating our brain to desire sex, to fantasize about sex. We fantasize about sex more in that ovulatory phase. Why I bring up estrogen and testosterone is because these are very, very important key players in women's health. And it's important to understand that as we get into late stage perimenopause and into menopause, that estrogen will absolutely drop off. You're going to get a little DHEA from your ovaries, but your estrogen is going to drop off. So DHEA, sorry, not from your ovaries, from your adrenal glands. DHEA is produced by the adrenal glands. It gets converted into estrogen and testosterone. You'll get a little bit there, but your estrogen will totally drop off. So if you're in late perimenopause or menopause and you're like, I'm not interested in sex, I'm not enjoying sex, maybe I'm having vaginal dryness, those can all be signs of low estrogen. And I think there are some very, very smart people out there who are in the sexual health world, and they talk a lot about how hormones really have nothing to do with it. I heard this one person talking about this. She's a brilliant researcher, in my opinion, and she said, with the caveat of birth control, because with birth control, it's tanking your testosterone, it's tanking your estrogen. You're getting that synthetic estrogen that's raising your sex hormone binding globulin. And the impact of that, there was a study that came out saying we should probably consider putting women on DHEA while they're on birth control because of the negative impact it's having on their hormones. We need more studies. We need to replicate that. We need to understand that further before I would tell anyone to jump on DHEA. Big reason is you don't want to grow hair on your chin, get cystic acne, and lose your hair on your head irreversibly. You would hate me for that. So DHEA is a wonderful hormone, but if you don't need it, you're gonna mess around. You're gonna find out in a very bad way. So we don't necessarily want to jump on that. But if we look at what's happening when you're on the pill, so specifically the pill, suppressing ovarian function, gobbling up all the hormones that it can with these binding proteins, that state of being, we know the ovaries shrink, we know, and that's reversible, just so everybody knows, but the tissue is not being used. The ovaries shrink. We know that there's a lot of symptoms that women experience on the pill that look a lot like postmenopause as well, like vaginal dryness, increased UTIs, increased yeast vaginitis, low libido, like these kinds of things. And so I bring this up because absolutely no one should have their hormones ignored when it comes to the conversation of low libido. It's not always a hormone issue. Sometimes your partner sucks and you need to get out of that relationship, and your body's like, I don't care. I don't care how good the sex is. Like, emotionally, we're not taken care of. Nervous system is fried. We're in chaos, not interested in this. But this is where we have to completely evaluate this individual. Now, I talk about a whole lot of hormones in the book. I would love to talk more about cortisol, but I think a big one is insulin. We understand from studies on penises that insulin dysregulation is bad for erections. Okay. Now, how does this translate? There's a lot of research out there that I will say, like, you can't just take a study on men and apply it to women. A penis is a clitoris. It wanted to be a clitoris. Poor penis. It went through a testosterone wash and it deviated. So if there wasn't a Y chromosome with the correct genes and testosterone coming through, that penis would have went to be a clitoris. It would have never been a penis. Okay. They had the same exact tissue. They both get engorged. Insulin resistance. So when we see erectile dysfunction, and I was even trained in this 20 years ago in my nutrition degree, if we see erectile dysfunction, we think cardiovascular disease and diabetes. That's the first thing we need to be thinking about ruling out, is what cardiometabolic issues are there. The same is true for women. The same is true because it's the exact same embryological tissue. It responds in the same way. And that is where insulin resistance and blood sugar dysregulation is super, super bad for your health. Okay. Because when it comes to diabetes, we can go blind, we can lose our feeling in our fingers and our toes, our kidneys are going to be damaged, and our clitoris can cease to function.
Wow. That is so helpful, I think, because obviously insulin resistance, blood sugar imbalances, dysregulation is so rampant in our society. So that's interesting. And is there anything else that you want to share around that? Because I do think that there's so much there to unpack with regard to the insulin.
Well, it's the it used to be like an unsexy thing to talk about, but apparently if you're French and you talk about glucose and insulin, then it becomes very hot. I'm just
Pretty hot.
the glucose goddess. But I laugh because I'm like, dang, I've been talking about like apple cider vinegar for like more than a decade. And everybody was just like, you're quack, you're crazy, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, there's actually research to support apple cider vinegar helping with glucose and insulin. Like it helps. There's been research for a very long time. But then like she comes out and she starts talking about it. And I'm like, that's what I was missing. I need a French accent. Because when she talks about it, it's very interesting. I'm like, I'm very intrigued. It's like my assistant is from the UK and she's got a British accent. And I'm like, I swear, like people, she like of all my assistants I've ever had, she has the easiest time. It's because she's got this British accent. People are just like, oh, so true. We need to get accents. Okay.
That's the difference. I'm sure of it. It's the way you say glucose.
Yeah. It's so I'm like glucose. I need to, yeah. anyhow,
blood sugar conversations are not sexy, right? This is not a fun conversation to have.
But I think that she does it really well. And like, I think, I know there's people out there that are like, she's not a doctor. She shouldn't be talking about this. And I'm like, look, if she gets people eating more fiber and moving their body more, I'm not mad about it. Okay. I'm not mad about it. So here's the thing. So yes, apple cider vinegar can be helpful before your meals. To the people out there, the doctors who are like, you're going to erode people's teeth. You don't hear dentists saying that. You hear gynecologists saying that. I always find that kind of funny because I'm like, wrong mouth, friend. Fun fact, the tissue that lines your cheeks, same tissue that lines the vagina. Okay. That's the only thing that comes together. My very first medical degree was in dentistry at 18. I became a registered dental assistant. So people, you are not going to destroy your teeth with apple cider vinegar if you are taking a shot of it and washing it with water, or if you're mixing it in a bit of water, which is what I actually recommend. You're not going to destroy your teeth with that. If you're swishing with apple cider vinegar, okay, stop. Let's not do that. So apple cider vinegar, absolutely great. When it comes to blood sugar, I want people to understand that if there is insulin and glucose chaos in the cells and affecting the cells, there's inflammation. There is going to be cortisol spikes. There's going to be issues with progesterone production that's going to pull on your estrogen. And the least of the things that we need is sex, right? To survive. So understand that your body is always going to prioritize survival. And your body also knows that like, well, when you have sex, that can result in a baby. So if you have blood sugar issues, if you're not eating a nutrient dense diet, You're not getting your fat, protein, fiber at every meal, and making sure that you stabilize your blood sugar. If you are skipping meals, if you're skipping sleep, if you're doing these kinds of things, you're signaling that the environment is unsafe. And the body, wanting to survive, will respond by shifting away from anything that is reproductively centered. So it starts with, let's not have sex, and it can end with, let's not have a period, depending on how extreme those stressors are.
So good. It's so good. And coming back to the sex drive, do you feel like there's truth in the story about women just having a lower sex drive than men?
No, absolutely not. I saw this magazine, I think it was like a cover, and it was like, Megan Fox has the libido of a teenage boy, or sex drive of and I was like,
Oh my God.
neat.
There's still
And
headlines like that? What? I feel like that's straight out of the 90s.
I know the tabloids are just like, oh my God, if a woman wants sex, she must be like a teenage boy. And I'm like, that is so dumb. Oh my God. I'm like, that's the second time I've called something dumb. I kind of feel judgy and mean in this interview, but I'm also just like, why are you doing this to women? Why are you doing this? You don't have to do this. Like, I don't know how people get up in the morning and like look at themselves in the mirror doing this stuff. So here's the thing. You are not broken if you don't want the same amount of sex that your partner wants. You are not broken if you don't think about sex all the time, and you are not broken if all you think about is sex. Or if you're somebody who's just like, I have had patients that are like, I want sex like every single day. Every single day. And my partner is, thinking something's wrong with me. There's nothing wrong with you. If that's how you operate, if that is your mode of operation, that's perfectly normal. We always have to just ask the question though, like, what's the drive really that's behind that? Is it pleasure? Is it connection? Is it, the vulnerability that exists in the partnership? Like, is it a stress relief? But if it's ever because like, I'm afraid my partner will cheat on me if I don't do this, or it's coming from a place that is more about fear and more about feeling like an obligation, that's less healthy. And that is something that we definitely want to get someone over to a mental health support ally that can help them unpack that and really understand that. Because sometimes that does create strain on the relationship when somebody's like, I feel very insecure. Someone's cheated on me in the past. I feel like you're not having sex with me every day, then you're having sex with somebody else. Okay. That's not a state that is healthy to live in and to dwell in. So we can work on that. But the idea that just because you have ovaries means that you don't want sex as much, no, that's not true.
Okay, that's good. And you talked about this, you alluded to this before about what we compare ourselves to. So obviously there is a spectrum, right? Some of us have quote unquote higher sex drives than others. But then there's all these, contributing factors.
Absolutely. And that's the thing to understand is that there's also phases of our lives. You talk about phases of your menstrual cycle. And I think you can also think about like the seasons, like there are seasons in your life. And, if you experience the loss of a loved one or like a loss of a pet, which I think as somebody who's like, I've been through that, I'm like, I think that is really hard to work through as well. And that we should acknowledge that in individuals. But if you're experiencing that, you may find yourself going into a winter season, right? Where you're like, I have work to do internally. The energy that I have to give right now is to process, to grieve, to work on that. And that's okay. If we get stuck somewhere, that's where it's like, okay, we need to get help. We need to get support so that we can come out of that. I also want people so there's times where your libido will ebb and flow. Your desire for sex will ebb and flow. And there are also times where you will have massive, massive stress and you'll be like, something must be wrong with me because I want more sex. When we survey people, we ask them, think of the best sex of your life. Now tell us what made the best sex of your life. It's not orgasm that tops the chart. It is connection. It is vulnerability. It is intimacy. There is a drive. So there's no real sex drive, right? We don't die without sex, but there is a drive for connection. We do know we live longer with community and connection. So it would be fair to say that like there is a drive, like we need as social creatures to have that connection. It doesn't always have to be that intimate, but for some of us, when we are in high states of stress, there's loss, there's all these things going on, and you would think like, this is the time that my libido is low. You may find your desire is higher, and your desire isn't necessarily for escape or for something pathological. The desire is more, I need connection. I need to feel like connected to somebody else and have that vulnerability, that intimacy in a way that I can't have in other relationships or other aspects.
So good. You said something else in the book too about losing the ability to orgasm if you don't do it enough. Can you talk about that? I feel like that probably freaks people out when they hear it.
Yeah, well, you should never totally lose your ability to orgasm. But what, you know how like we think about muscle atrophy, and like if you're not using the muscle, then you start to lose it. You're not going to delete the nerve cells like you delete muscle cells. That's more scary, honestly, to be like, you delete those for good. But, there has been some research saying, hey, if you're not stimulating this tissue regularly, you're not reinforcing those neuronal pathways. And I think the most important takeaway from this is if you are somebody who hasn't had sex in years, you haven't had an orgasm in years, if you come back to being intimate with yourself or someone else, not to get frustrated and discouraged with yourself, not to be hating on yourself, like, how we're like, this is my fault, I did something bad, like, that propensity that we can, spiral in our own minds as women, to just recognize that it can take some time to get to know your body again, to start stimulating those tissues again, getting your brain and your genitals talking and everything working in the way that you would expect it to. It is all to say, be gentle and be patient with yourself.
Yeah, and that actually leads into something else I wanted to ask you about, myths around masturbation that I feel exist, and I would love for you to debunk. Are there like a few myths that are very common that you feel should be laid to rest?
You just want us to get so much hate today.
I know, girl. I'm sorry. I just love all
No,
this
it's
stuff.
fine. It's just like, this is like the way it is that I talk about the science and people are like, well, that doesn't track with my beliefs, therefore I hate you. And I'm like, okay, like I can't control that.
Yeah. We have a common online experience, you and I.
Yeah. So here's the thing is that, okay, if men ejaculate, most men are not going to be able to have an erection and orgasm again. And so based again, that once we go, okay, here's the male standard, therefore just apply it to women. There's a myth that basically, if a woman has an orgasm, she's going to use it up. And then there's nothing left over for like her male partner. That is one myth that happens with masturbation. And the reality is that women can have multiple orgasms. The refractory period, that is like the peak, the drop, and then coming back, much shorter in women. So they can have multiple orgasms. There are men that can have multiple orgasms, but they are much more rare than what you see. And there's people that argue you really have to practice at that to be able to do that as a man. So that's one myth. I think one of the biggest myths is that if a woman masturbates, it's because she's dissatisfied in her relationship. And what's interesting again is that in some heterosexual relationships, by the way, I should have just been very clear, that's what most of the research we have is heterosexual relationships. So in most heterosexual relationships, so not most, but some, I should say, if men are masturbating, it may be because they're not sexually satisfied, or maybe everything's totally fine and that doesn't even matter. But what they found with women is that if a woman is masturbating, it's correlated much higher that she's completely sexually satisfied and happy in her relationship. So women who have a propensity to masturbate, if you think about it from this way, if you have a partner who is supporting you, who is task sharing in the household, they freed up mental energy for you. They freed up energy for you to be that sexual being. And so that's the other thing I think is really important when it comes to women's libido, is that if you're not chipping in a heterosexual relationship, if men are not chipping in and they're not helping out, she's carrying this extra mental burden that's creating so much static in her nervous system that like the airwaves cannot get through of any sexy signals. But when it comes to masturbation, I think it's just really important that people understand that a woman who is masturbating in a relationship is usually a woman who is very happy in her relationship.
Well, I love that. I like that. To me, it's so amazing to just see that there's such a massive difference between men and women in the research, and it's been sort of I hear that and I just feel so frustrated because I just feel like, why is it that we've used the male standard for pretty much everything? Well, I know why, but I'm just, yeah, annoyed by that. But I'm glad to hear it.
How do you
Glad
think
to hear
men
it.
feel though? Like I talk about this in the book, like how, like, you know, in all of this, like we talk about it from like the female perspective, but like, how do you think men feel that like there's been these myths about like women's sexual satisfaction? There's been this myth, like they've been told things like they should be a stallion and they should go forever, and women don't even want that. That like, you know, you even got Freud being like, oh yeah, it should be like vaginal orgasms for everyone, and like men not even being taught about the clitoris. And so I think we have to stand back and recognize that like it's frustrating for everybody that these myths have been perpetuated. And I hear it from a lot of men too that are like, God, I would have really have loved to have known that, because you know, if you get on the internet, there's certainly, and you talk to women, there's women who have had bad experiences with men. And when I talk about this stuff, I get comments from women who are like, men are just trash, men don't care about women's pleasure. In my experience in talking to many men at many conferences, online, patients in relationships, they care very much. Like a lot of them feel like, you know, it's in some ways like this, a burden, so to speak, in that they feel like they have to be the one delivering pleasure. But why I say burden is because they also have been gate kept from so much information. And they're like, how do I do this? Here's the secret, everybody. Talk about sex with your partner. Talk about it. Communication. And here's the best part, even though we're like told like, don't talk about sex, that the research actually shows us that people who talk about sex, they have the best sex. Oh, spoiler. If you actually communicate, you have really good sex.
Total shocker. And so just to wrap things up, are there any other things aside from talking about sex, so you have good sex, that someone might want to do or could do to help support their libido or bring it back if they have lost their libido or their libido is diminished?
I have a 28-day program at the end of the book that takes you through. So it takes you through, you can just go the hormone route and you can just fix your hormones and feel better and have great periods and get through perimenopause. And you can do all of that. But I also give exercises that are very specific to the menstrual cycle. So for example, when you talk about one of the biggest things that hinders sexual desire, or you're in it, you're in the heat of the moment, and then you fall out of it because you start like observing yourself and judging yourself, body image issues. And like the magazines have also done us no favors with this. And so your relationship with your body matters so much. There's one exercise that I give like around ovulation, like getting naked in front of the mirror and just documenting everything you love about yourself. Why ovulation? Because when estrogen is plumping up your tissue, you have less fine lines and wrinkles, your breasts are not as droopy as they will be like when you're on your period and estrogen drops, like your hips are going to be curvier, like you're also, your brain is set up so that you are feeling yourself, like you're just feeling yourself. You're like, I look good, my energy's good, like everything's good. That's a great time to just document like what you love about yourself. And then in the luteal phase, when it inevitably starts to creep in like 3 to 5 days before your period, where, you know, if the hormones are not right, then neither is the self-talk. When you start to feel like you're going to hate on yourself or you're feeling insecure and you're like, it's, by the way, it's always okay not to have sex with the lights on. But if you're like, I don't want to get naked in front of my partner, I don't want to have sex with the lights on, like, oh, I don't like the way my body looks right now, like, you can go back to that journal of what you wrote down and remind yourself of how much you actually love yourself. And I also want people to understand women often will be like, oh, what does my body look like? Oh, like, everybody's like, sex makes gross noises and it's messy. Yeah, it is. It's weird and it's gross and like, it's cool. Okay. Like, that's just the way it is. But the other thing is that women will think like, oh God, are they looking at my rolls in this position? Oh, what does my cellulite look like right now? Like, oh, like my tissue stretching this way. Is it gross? Like we're like, and maybe you're not, if you're not, let us know in the comments. You're awesome. How did you get out of this? Because it's very common. We see from the research that women fall into this spectatoring where you're literally on the bleachers judging yourself for everything. That's a very, very common experience. But you want to know what is almost universally true? If somebody is lucky enough to have sex with you, they are not thinking about any of those things. And in fact, neurologically speaking, their brain can't really handle all of that, like criticism and nitpicking. They wouldn't be able to do it because they're flooded with hormones that are just like, this feels good, this is amazing, and all their senses are doing other things. So if you are somebody who gets in your head, yes, I have exercised all of this stuff in the book, but I just want to remind you that you're the only one who will ever be as critical of your body in those moments like that. Your partner is not doing that. And if they are, will revoke access. They're done. They do not get access anymore.
Yeah, so much truth in that. Thank you so much. This was an amazing conversation. I would love for you to share where everyone can find you and your amazing book, Is This Normal?
DRBRIGHTEN.com, drbrighten.com. That's my main hub. That's where you can find tons of information. It is like the Google of women's medicine, as many of our readers have said. We just have tons of information. So if I'm like, hey, how would somebody know to find this information? You find it at drbrighten.com. I will help you out when it comes to really any hormonal challenge that you're facing. And then you can find me all over social media at Dr. Jolene Brighten.
Thank you. Thanks, Jolene. This was amazing. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having a fun conversation with me. And I would love to hear what people think in the comments.
That's a wrap. Be sure to click that subscribe button to join me for more Girl Talk Gone Menstrual in upcoming episodes. But in the meantime, check out my latest Period Party episode. And if you're looking for a deeper dive into your hormones, go ahead and take my period quiz at NicoleJardim.com/quiz.